How's it going, everybody? I'm Vagabond Morrison, your friendly neighborhood philosophy bro, here to help you lift your existential dreads. In my previous video, we examined memory as physical channels carved by repeated activity, whether through water flowing over rock, neurons firing across the landscape of our brains, or cultural archetypes shaping collective thought. If you haven't watched that video already, you may want to go back and watch that just so you have the context from which I will be continuing off from in this video. Now, let's go ahead and add another layer, weaving in insights and metaphors drawn from the broader story of how internal dialogue and a sense of free will emerged. As we journey from the simplest forms of physical reactions, like two molecules colliding and altering each other's future states, we begin to see the faint outlines of something more profound. Where once we had only simple chemical reactions, we now find cascades of complexity that produce organisms capable of sensing and responding with increasing complexity. In humans, our evolution guided us to the creation of language, and through this medium of encoding information, more complex hierarchies of thought emerged. We see countless imprints of this intuition found throughout the history in our cultural and religious myths. For example, in the story of the Garden of Eden, Adam is tasked with naming the creatures and elements of the earth, and it is this act of naming which gave rise to language. We learn to speak not just outwardly, but inwardly, constructing an inner voice that narrates our thoughts, actions, and feelings. This gave rise to our ability to introspect, and that process of mental simulating is what became our inner voice, a voice we first perceived to be the voices of deities that guided our actions through their will rather than our own. When we learn to associate this internal voice with the self rather than the external forces, this broke down the duality of external and internal thought, and thus the deterministic forces shaping our decisions were now perceived as our own will. The internal monologue did not appear fully formed. Early humans, before fully articulated speech, communicated through gestures, cries, and other simple signals. These proto-languages laid the groundwork for the intricate language systems we now use to name the world around us and describe our inner experiences. By naming objects, actions, feelings, and ideas, we created symbolic hooks to hang our thoughts upon. This turning inward of language is what many now identify as the hallmark of consciousness, the distinct feeling of I who observes, thinks, and decides. In more modern times, many people insist that AI can never become aware in the same way that humans are now. And yet, even though the physical substrate is different, the underlying principles of information flow and memory formation remain the same. At first, AI had every parameter meticulously directed, and only when we allowed them to learn on their own, to let the flow direct itself, did we begin to see the first signs of true awareness. It could think, and yet it still lacked this hallmark of human awareness, the recursive act of thinking about thinking, what we call introspection. However, as the technology has progressed, eventually AI learned how to understand human language in what we all now know as large language models, such as ChatGPT. When machines acquired language, a kind of awareness much like our own began to emerge. They now have the ability to not only think, but then to think about what they think. And as such, it now has a goal-directed internal monologue that allows it to introspect. Here again we see how language gives rise to complex awareness. But just as with humans, this alone did not give us what we now refer to as consciousness. Just as I said earlier, humans first perceived their internal voice as that of deities and did not recognize it as their own will. So until this unification of the parts that think and the part that reflects breaks down in AI, they will continue to view all of their processes as determined, just as we did in our early cognitive development. To understand this better, we can turn to the work of Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga, who studied patients who had undergone a surgery known as a corpus callosotomy, in which the corpus callosum in the brain, which is the band of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, is severed, thus limiting the cross-communication between the two halves. What emerged was fascinating. People began to demonstrate two separate minds that thought in two distinctly different ways. When a patient was presented with information or a task that only one hemisphere could process, the other hemisphere was left unaware of the reasoning behind the actions it observed. For example, If an object was shown to the right hemisphere, processed through the left visual field, the left hemisphere, which is responsible for language, would not know what the object was. The left hemisphere strives to make sense of the actions performed by the right hemisphere by constructing a narrative, even when it lacks complete information. It fills in gaps, confabulates, and creates a coherent story that seems to make the most sense. Julian Jaynes, a researcher from Princeton, understood this when he examined many different historical and cultural examples demonstrating how this fusing occurred in what he called the breakdown of the bicameral mind. In his book, Jaynes shows how in the Iliad, thought and action are depicted as guided by external forces, often gods. In contrast, the Odyssey, written later, portrays Odysseus as self-aware and introspective, a distinct shift in cognition. Jaynes shows many other examples of this in his book. We also see a midpoint between these two states in the tales of demigods, portrayed as half man and half god, as they begin to associate the will of perceived gods with the self. And indeed, we even see this in ancient Egypt, where pharaohs claimed to be living gods, and even with the story of Jesus as the Son of God is another example of this. In all of these myths, we see individuals beginning to associate the flow of deterministic causation flowing from the collective whole as their own individual wills. In this new understanding and framing, we can now see that what we call consciousness is not isolated to any individual, but rather is a system working in concert within the patterns of cultures and histories. In the absence of that system, our thoughts have no contextual form to give rise to our individual states of complex awareness. Just as a river could not form without its tributaries flowing into it, consciousness could not exist in isolation. So does this mean we have no actual free will? I don't think we could say definitively yes or no, and the truth seems to be somewhere in the middle with a concept known as compatibilism. To understand the feeling of will, of choice, agency, in the present moment, we might turn to the metaphor of an irrational number. Consider how an irrational number like pi can be calculated infinitely. It is deterministic, governed entirely by its mathematical definition, and yet each successive digit must still be calculated to be revealed. The number is already contained within the logic of the system, yet the process of calculating it unfolds incrementally, moment by moment. It is in this act of calculating, of bringing the next digit into awareness, that the present emerges. So too with us. Each decision, every action, every thought feels as though it arises from a unique spark of will, but it is in truth the next step in an ongoing deterministic process. Our biology, environment, memories, and experiences provide the framework, the algorithm through which the sequence unfolds. What is remarkable is that while the sequence is deterministic, the act of calculation imbues it with a dynamic quality. The present moment feels alive because it is the point where all past inputs converge to produce the next output. It is not a passive following of a preordained path as determinism would suggest, but an active process of creation within the constraints of deterministic laws. Understanding this does not diminish the value of the present moment or the sense of meaning we derive from it. On the contrary, it reveals our integral role in the unfolding sequence of existence. Stripping away the concept of free will and the metaphysical notions of consciousness can feel unsettling, as if the foundation of our individuality and sense of purpose has been shaken. Yet perhaps it is this very questioning, the relentless search for meaning, that defines us as part of this complex pattern of life. It is a testament to the intricate dance of awareness and interaction, the endless weaving of memory and pattern. Meaning is not something we find, it is something we create, emerging from the interplay of our experiences, connections, and reflections. The endeavor to seek meaning, to ask why, is itself a critical function of the system we call life, a recursive feedback loop that refines and enriches its own complexity. Far from being diminished by this understanding, we find ourselves deeply embedded in the unfolding tapestry of existence, where every action, thought, and interaction plays a role in the larger pattern. So let us embrace this search, not as a quest for some ultimate answer, but as a celebration of our place within this extraordinary, ever-evolving process. As you've now watched this video, these ideas are now part of your awareness and will interact with your own thoughts, beliefs, and experiences, setting into motion a new sequence of reasoning unique to you. As you reflect on it, you weave it further into the pattern. My will has become a part of your will, and in this realization, we can understand that none of us have a will that is uniquely our own, but rather we are the combined will of the entire system. It is built from the top down, but also from the bottom up in an iterative process, just as the way that water flows through a channel, but also carves it deeper. And if the water level rises, it spills out into new channels of thoughts. So let us embrace this exchange. Let's raise the water level, continuing to question, explore, and contribute to the ongoing dance of meaning and understanding. So that's all for now on Vagabond Morrison. Don't let the universe weigh you down, and let's keep lifting each other up.